I have already showed you on my channel how to assemble a kimono from any fabric you can find like everywhere around the globe. Whatever you like, this is what you can turn into kimono. There is no must that you have to make a kimono out of a kimono bolt. Believe me, using kimono bolts was not always a thing in Japanese history either. So any fabric you like is absolutely fine for this. Anyway, I still receive many requests to show how to assemble a kimono from a kimono cloth, a so-called tanmono, and this is what I want to show you in this video. In case you're here for the first time, my name is Matsunaga and I'm a fully trained and certified kimono teacher and stylist. And when you're really here for the first time, I will have to stress again, yes, I am a kimono teacher. I have a certification in that. But it doesn't mean that I'm a kimono tailor because I don't have a certification in that. Kimono teacher means I am the one you can come to when you want to learn about kimono history, when you want to learn about how kimono are made in theory, not actually praxis, because you actually don't really do that in your training as a kimono teacher. Or you can come to me when you want to learn how to put on a kimono correctly or in a specific shape, or when you want to talk about creating a kimono silhouette, or when you want to learn how to dress others. That is when you can come to me. Kimono tailor is actually a completely different certification, and I did not take that. I didn't take the time and the money to do it. But here's the thing, you will see me sewing a kimono in this video, and yes, you will also get some tutorial-like things for how to sew a kimono, but still keep in mind that I'm not a professional when it comes to kimono sewing. I do study because I am a super perfectionist in a very professional environment. I'm going to a sewing school that actually teaches real kimono tailors or trains real kimono tailors. And that is why I do have a very specific knowledge about how to make a kimono that is very kimono tailor-like, but I'm not a kimono tailor. So I am the person you can come to when you want to have just general advice from a sewing oni-san. And worst case, I'm just gonna message my sewing teacher and ask her. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into the past, where I actually started to prepare this bowl of kimono that you can see I'm actually wearing it. Yay! I prepared this bowl of kimono to be sewed. And hello, a few weeks earlier. I wonder how many weeks earlier. We'll see how long this kimono will take me to make. I'm going to make this kimono out of this bowl. It is Shinosuke Jofu. I talk about them so often in my videos. Shinosuke Jofu is my favorite remi kimono maker. For those who don't know what remi is not hemp and also not linen. I refused for a very long time to call remi kimono hemp because it's not hemp. It is not hemp, it's a completely different plant. So on this channel, I called it linen for a very long time. It's also not linen. I knew it's not linen, but hemp itself was actually illegal in Japan, so I wanted to use a different name. And last year, I found out that what other people refer to as hemp and what I'm referred to as linen is actually remi. So this bowl is 45% cotton and 55% remi. You call this in Japanese men asa because it's a mixture of men, cotton, and asa, remi. And it means it's a very soft fabric. It's softer than a pure remi kimono. I love this one so much because the warp yarn and the weft yarn are actually different colors. It's yellow and pink, and in total it gives this copper look. And I don't know if you can see this on camera. According to how the light touches the fabric, it slightly changes color and it has this really nice shine to it. This fabric is actually a fabric I bought at Kokoroya, my friend's store. I think 3 or 4 years ago. I have so many fabrics in my closet that I actually should sew by myself, and I never really get to it. So this year I'm going to tackle this bold finally. And I can't wait to wear this. Before you start sewing a kimono, of course, you would first prepare the fabric. And this is a remi fabric. And with remi fabrics and cotton fabrics, it's so loud, honestly. That's why in summer I never shoot in the morning. For remi fabrics and cotton fabrics, you do the same thing. You do something that is called mizutoshi. Mizutoshi is definitely something you can do at home. If your bolt you have in front of you right now is silk and you live in Japan, I do recommend to bring it to a kimono cleaner store. They usually also offer preparations, what to do with fabrics before it's sewed. And you have actually 3 options. And I'm probably gonna talk about those options in another video. Let me know in the comments if you want to know more about that. But as I said, mizutoshi is really something you can do at home, and we're gonna do it together. So let's leave this really loud room here. And I can already see the comments asking why I am using the shower to fill in our bathtub. And that is because our house has a super modern Japanese bathtub that fills itself automatically. I only press a button and it fills itself. But there is only a setting for hot water. And the only way I can get cold water in my shower room here is the actual shower. I mean, who would create a bathtub you can fill with cold water? I don't know. I really don't know. But Japan. So I fill the bathtub until I have enough water for the whole bowl. And then I just take the fabric off the bowl and put it into the water. And I let this sit for about 3 hours. This mizutoshi, mizu means cold water. Yes, there's a different word for warm water in Japanese. Cold water, and tosu means putting through. So I'm putting the fabric through cold water, or I'm putting water through the fabric or the fiber, if you want to say so. It's like what you would refer to as pre-washing in Western sewing. After those 3 hours, I'm gonna take it out of the bath, hang it up and let it dry. And tomorrow, hopefully I can iron it with loads of steam to pre-shrink it as good as I can. Because as we know, linen, remi and cotton tends to shrink a lot when you wash it. And yes, I'm going to wash that kimono. So I'm trying to pre-shrink it as good as I already can, so I don't have any surprises in the future. Again, you don't do this for silk fabrics. You only do mizutoshi for cotton, remi and linen fabrics in kimono sewing. So here's the finished bolt, ready to be sewed. It's so soft and nice. I really love it. The first thing we now have to do is actually to measure it. I know that the label said it's 13.5 meter long, but this is actually just an indicator of what kind of fabric it is. In kimono tags, they unfortunately use, instead of a name, they use a length of what that fabric is. So when you have a 12 meter or 12.5 meter fabric, that usually means it's a bolt for a nagajupan, and when it's a 13.5 or 30 meter fabric, it usually means it's a kimono length. But that doesn't actually tell you how long the bolt actually is. I know this is wildly confusing, but this is how it works. Okay, let's measure from the beginning. And I'm using my Japanese measure. I will have to count, so this is gonna be really fun, you know. Okay. So the bolt said it's a 13.5 meter long, but actually I have 14.3 meter of bolt. That is extremely long for a kimono bolt. And what I'm gonna do now is I have my measurements, because I'm always sewing for myself, so I have my measurements. Now I'm gonna calculate down how long each piece has to be, how much I will have left over, and then I'm thinking of how to put the leftovers in, for example, the uchiage. A lot of people ask me what an uchiage is for in my how to make a kimono the easy way video. And the uchiage is basically just fabric you can let out later. For example, when you want to lengthen the kimono, or when your hem got damaged and you have to cut that off, then you just let that length of the uchiage out and you have still a kimono in your length. I'm probably gonna do a big uchiage on this kimono too, because it's very long. I will also have a lot of leftover of this. So let me do some calculations and I'm gonna check in with you later. So I have all my measurements calculated out. I do recommend to do so, always. I'm sorry I'm not gonna show it to you because my size does not really matter on this channel. And I do recommend to always write it out, because very often when you start sewing something, I sometimes have like months in between until I touch it again. And when you have it all written out, it's easy to revisit the same project and just move on with your measurements. And in case you have already everything marked out, you also know where you would have to find a marking somewhere. So I have written out main piece length, yuki, the length of the sleeves. I have the width of the sleeve, the width of the shoulder, I have the length of the sleeve, I have my front width and my back width. Then I have the sleeve seam, how long it has to be, because I tend to forget it, how long I usually make it. Okumi, just to be sure that I don't forget that, and aizumahaba and erishita, all the measurements you need to make a kimono. And now I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna put all my measurements onto the fabric. As I'm using this pin-on board, I can do it like I learned it with my first kimono sewing teacher. So I'm basically just pinning the fabric onto the board and rolling it out into the length I need, and then fold it over. You usually start at the sleeves, but you also don't have to. This already goes into pattern placement, and I have already established on my Instagram quite big that I'm not good with pattern placement on kimono bolts. I need my teacher, or I always had my teacher actually looking over it, and as soon as I do it alone, it never really works out pretty well. I think I'm gonna get there. It's just I don't have a lot of experience in it. This kimono doesn't have any dyed pattern. You call this irumuji, which means I don't have to worry about the pattern placement at all. I cut out 2 long pieces that are as long as I am tall for the main pieces, the so-called migoro. 2 pieces for the sleeves, and 1 long piece that will be later cut in half for okumi and eri, the collar. And then I'm gonna thread mark all the folds that are essential. Folds that are essentials are the katayama. This is where you fold the main piece over. And the sodayama, where you fold the sleeves over. And I also thread marked the okumi with a tiny arrow, so it shows me which side should be facing upwards. And after that, I will go with the thread pulling method and cut the fabric into pieces. Make sure that you don't cut any folds that are really essential. That is why this method of rolling the bolt like this out is absolutely brilliant, because you only have to cut the folds on one side. The reasons why I started learning how to sew a kimono are quite easy. 1, I in general think that sewing is a forgotten important skill in our modern life, especially hand sewing. People were able to fix things at home. Nowadays we're not really, and it's not really passed down. When you're one of those people who were taught by their parents or grandparents how to sew, you were very, very lucky. I actually wasn't really. I had some sewing classes when I was in elementary school, and that's basically it. I do think that being able to sew is very important in our daily life. It makes everything way easier. It also is good for the environment because you can mend clothes. The second reason is that kimono sewing actually goes hand in hand with a kimono life. Even when you're just a collector, there is one point definitely where you will have to mend one of your kimonos, because kimonos are not made to last. They're made to last, but the seams are not made to last, because in history and still today, the best way to clean a kimono is actually taking off all the seams, put it back into the kimono bolt, clean it, remove shrinkage, and then reassemble it. They also, by the way, put on starch during this whole process, which actually will re-strengthen the fiber and actually will make your kimono last even longer. But you will have to re-sew it. And retailoring a kimono or tailoring a kimono costs from $150 to $200. When it's really expensive, $220. And that's a lot of money, especially because you're supposed to do that cleaning process that is called araihari at least once a year or once in 2 years. I don't do it that often. I actually do it every 4 to 5 years, but I do it. And I do more kimono in 1 year, and I would not have the money to have them tailored all back to my size. It's easier to stitch them together by myself then. Being able to sew a kimono will make you able to change the size of it when it doesn't really fit. But yeah, being able to sew a kimono is actually quite important in a normal kimono life. Let's go back to sewing. And after I have finished the cutting process, I'm using my Japanese sewing iron, the so-called kote, to mark out all my measurements that I need, and I had calculated down. If you need help for your measurements, I do have slightly explained them in my How to Make a Kimono the Easy Way video, But I do promise very soon there will be a video on my channel that will go really into detail of how you calculate out your true kimono size. So after the marking out process that usually takes a while, it's time to start sewing. And the first seams I always start with is the so-called uchiage. And I fold the fabric in length where my markings are, and then I pin it together and sew them down. Then I flip this over and fold them towards the hem, and this is where I iron them in place. And then I'm basting this tuck in place. These basting stitches stay on, so I'm setting them right under my seam, and I try to only show 2 mm of the stitching on the front of the fabric. For the center back seam, I recommend doing a French seam. So I pinned the back panels together, wrong side on wrong side first, and sewed this down. A kimono is usually stitched together with running stitches, but there are some points on the kimono you will have to backstitch, and I'm going to mention all those points, no worries. One of those points you will need a backstitch is where the center back seam hits or crosses the uchiage. You sew this together with a backstitch because you have to sew 6 layers of fabric there, and that's quite a lot. So backstitch will make it easier to make sure that you actually went through all the layers. There is a big reason why I have put off this video for quite a long time. And the reason was not actually to gain more confidence in my sewing or if I am a professional kimono sewing teacher or not. I don't know if you have noticed, but the ultimate target or goal of my channel is to make kimono more inclusive. So it doesn't matter if you speak Japanese or not, it doesn't matter where you live, your race doesn't matter, your size doesn't matter. The ultimate goal of this channel is that everyone who wants to wear kimono can wear kimono. And you get professional advice, you get first-hand information that you probably can't get when you don't speak or when you can't read fluently Japanese. When you want to sew a kimono very traditional, like I do here, there are a few problems that actually open up. And one of the first problems is size. There is a huge problem with kimono and sizing, by the way, because kimono bolts have those very specific sizes. You have like a limitation in size you can create with those bolts. And when you're oversized, by meaning when you're taller than the average Japanese or when you are wider than the average Japanese, you will have to buy 2 bolts to actually make one kimono. And when you buy kimono second-hand, or when you want to retailer kimono that are already existing into your size, when you don't want to do patchwork, I don't think you will ever find like the exact same pattern twice. Oh, it happens, by the way, but you are also, if you do, you're very lucky. After pressing the seam allowance down, it's time for the side seam. When pinning the back and front panel on both sides together, keep in mind that your seam allowance on those panels is not the same because your back width and your front width is definitely different. By the way, it's the front width that has to be shorter than the back width. Anyway, when you pin those two together, really make sure to match up the markings of your side seams on both panels. You can see that I'm flipping over the panel several times to make sure that my pin actually went through the marking on both panels. And by the way, one of those people on this earth who actually can't whistle. Ask my husband. He's always laughing at me because I can't whistle. The accessibility is extremely important to me. That is why my first kimono sewing tutorial on this channel was me taking a piece of fabric that you can cut in every length and size you want and make a kimono out of it. And using none of the very traditional sewing items just to make it possible for you to make your own kimono that is probably not made the traditional way, but is authentic in how it looks and how it's actually made. And I already talked about it. Another problem is really sewing utilities, because when you want to make a kimono like I do right now, you need to have the utilities for it. And I think the biggest barrier you have here is actually the so-called kote. Oh, it's really hot. Or I refer to this as Japanese sewing iron. I know that you can work around not using this, but I was always taught to use it by every sewing teacher I've ever been to. So not using a kote is for me extremely weird. When I would make a kimono sewing tutorial, you can bet the kote is in there when it's traditionally, like in this video. I also often receive questions if I do know any sewing books in English or any other languages. And here's the thing. As I just said, goal of this channel is to provide first-hand and authentic information, which means I have never touched an English book or even a German book about kimono. Because I am lucky enough that I'm fluent in Japanese and I'm also a fast Japanese reader. This means I don't have to read anything in English. Also, don't underestimate how hard it is to get English literature or any other literature in Japan. I'm living on an island. I would have to import those books. So I rather buy books I already have here about something that actually is Japanese. Nevertheless, I do know someone who wrote a book. I don't know if she has already published it in English, but she did publish it in Spanish. So when you can read Spanish, you should check out Minna no Kimono. I'm also gonna link her Instagram down below. I know her sewing teacher. Like, she came to Japan to learn kimono sewing, and I actually know her teacher. So she's legit. And give her a follow too. She's really nice and I love her. And also, one of my Instagram friends started to post more about kimono tailoring in English. She's Japanese. Her name is Miki. I'm also gonna link her English account. She's actually a professional kimono sewing teacher or tailor, and I am hoping that she will also do some online lessons in English in the future. We'll see. Don't pressure her, honestly, because doing this kind of lessons in also a language that is not your native language takes a lot of confidence and also preparation. I think she's planning to do it, but don't rush her into things, please. These days, I think I'm really good at unshin, and I started to practice blind stitching with unshin too, because that's something I really can't do. I am now training every day, just 5 rows with blind stitching unshin, because you will only get better at it when you actually practice it. こんにちは。ハリヤが気になると。私のハリヤはおい、ランチどうしてよこれ。This is also how I learned unshin. I had a practice piece of cloth like I showed you in my video about how to do unshin, and I practiced a few rows every day. So when you're watching this video and you're just at the beginning of your sewing journey, it took me 7 years to become a hand sewer like I am today. And there's still skills I can't really do. So don't be hopeless. It's just a lot of practice. Do not forget that everyone you're probably watching here on YouTube and is sewer, they're very often doing it already for almost their whole life, or at least for a very, 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 very long time. After finishing the side seams, I pressed them down. And it was time to mark out and sew the sleeves. I personally like my sleeves when they're 52 centimeters long, and the width has to be a tiny bit wider than half of your yuki. And I also mark the round corner on the bottom. The bottom of the sleeves is going to be a French seam again. So I pinned the bottom of the sleeves together first, wrong side and wrong side, and sewed it in place. After sewing this in place, I pressed the seam and turned the sleeve inside out and pinned the bottom once more, this time at my markings for the length of the sleeve. This second seam is going to be connected to the sleeve opening, going all the way off the round corner, so I'm also pinning this already together to just finish this off in one seam. So I finished off one of the sleeves already. I think it's turned out really pretty. And we're doing one of the sleeves together now. I have already sewed from the sleeve opening down to the round corner here, that is called tanmono, and then here all the way to the edge. And this side here is left completely open because I identify as a woman and it's gonna be a women's kimono. If you wanna do a sleeve for men's kimono, I have a video for that on my channel. Feel free to check that out. I have linked it in the top right corner or down below. The bottom here is a French seam, so the edge here is actually encased. And no, I haven't shown you this in any of my other sewing tutorials because this is a very traditional way to do the sleeves. And now I'm going to show you how to form this round corner here. You can see that I have made a second stitching right next to the round corner, and my needle is still connected to this with the thread. It's double threaded, by the way. Also, there are many different ways how to do this, so This is just my way. I think it's a mixture of the many ways I have been shown how to do this. So first of all, I want to fold this edge here towards me, and I'm gonna iron this in, as always, kisekake, to the round corner about here. And now I'm gonna put my marumi in this, and I used a 3 centimeter corner. If you need a marumi, I have this for download for free on my Patreon page. Everyone can access this. If I don't forget, it's linked down below. If I forget, please tell me in the comments that I have to link this. And when I have this in there, I'm gonna pull this thread to shape this. And I pull this in place, trying my best here. And I try to fold this here nicely down with my fingers. You can see I'm trying to hold this with all fingers I have available. So this is how you do this. So I'm trying to have this edge here wrinkle free, and then I take my iron and I iron this edge in place. And then I'm wetting this with a sprayer. It's just regular water, and I am ironing this again. And then I'm tying this up, and I'm already taking the marumi out. And then I am sewing these parts here roughly in place so they will stay as they are. Just sewing this together. Make sure not to sew this on here on your actual sleeve. You don't want to show these stitches. Well, this was not a really good job on my side this time, honestly. But you know what? It's the camera curse. As soon as you turn on the camera, you won't be able to work as you would usually be able to. It's Murphy's Law. Absolutely Murphy's Law. Okay. Now we have already marked out the seam allowance here on this side and also on this side of the sleeve opening. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna fold this in and we do a rolled hem. I think it's really hard for some people to understand what should happen around the sleeve opening, because you have to roll this to two sides. You have to open up this nice ironed down two edges here, which means you will have to open it up to the other side. And what I'm doing is really just turning it and open one side up and fold it over. And ironing this down. And I have also marked out the sleeve opening size here. So this is where, from the end of my seam here, this is where I'm just gonna fold down into a rolled hem. Then I made a very tiny mistake by blind stitching both sides down, and I ended up opening the seam of the open side, which means to please only finish off the side with the sleeve opening, not the other side as well. Lastly, I basted the bottom seam and the tanmono, the round curve, down so it will stay in shape, and the sleeves were finished. Then I decided to finish off the side seams, which makes actually no sense at this point, but I wanted to do it. So fold the seam allowance in and tuck it under. And I do this until the miyatsuguchi. Those will stay open. So you have to fold open the uchiage to both sides, so you can later use the edges to actually finish this opening off with a rolled hem. This is then going to be blind stitched down. Then it was time to cut out the second front panel, the so-called okumi. That has to be marked out again. The okumi width has to be 15 centimeter. That's a set width. And you also want to mark out where your collar is going to end on the okumi. And usually that point is half of your height. When you pin the okumi on, really make sure that you follow your thread marking that will show you which side has to face upwards. This is then laid onto the front panel, right side on right side, and sew together with a running stitch. The seam allowance is then also folded over, tucked under, and blind stitched in place. But I did this off camera this time. Before you can finish the hem with a rolled hem, you will first have to finish the corners, the so-called gakubuchi. When you want to have it really nice, you're gonna do them first. First, iron down your seam allowance for a rolled hem. And then I fold both rolled hems down and mark out where they're going to meet each other. And then I also mark out the center of those 2 points. It may also help when you draw out that line that connects those 2 points. So to make it a tiny bit clearer, this is what you have marked out. You have marked out A, B, and C point. Then I take a threaded needle, put it through A, and pull it out at C. And I still leave some of the thread on the side of A. I fold it then in half at point B. And then I put again the needle through C and through A. And I make sure that A and C aligns perfectly. Tie a knot with the 2 threads at A. And then you start to stitch the distance from A to B with tiny back stitches. When I reached B, I don't tie it off. I stitch back for about half of the distance and then I cut the thread off. Then I fold the seam allowance open and iron it nicely in place. And when you turn that then inside out, you have a perfect corner. Shape the corner a little bit so it's really crisp. And then you can start to fold the hem into a rolled hem and pin it down. And this is then blind stitched down. While I was making the kimono, actually my sewing teacher visited and showed me how she does her gakubuchi, which is a tiny bit different, but the outcome is actually the same. And we'll see, I'm gonna give it a try, and probably in a future video I will also show you this way how to do it. So we're getting to the point that we have to finish off this kimono because I'm going on a business trip and I want to take this kimono with me. There are only 3 things left to do. First of all, I have to attach the ishikiate. This is what I'm gonna do today. And I will also have to attach the sleeves, which I'm probably also gonna do today because I love attaching the sleeves. And then I will have to attach the collar. And this is probably the thing I'm gonna do tomorrow. The reason why I'm gonna do the ishikiate today is because I can use my right arm fully right now because I just got vaccinated yesterday. And blind stitching is not that big of a movement. I think blind stitching will be fine. But let's do not talk too much about that because I don't want to get political or any kind of my channel. It's a fun channel. Still, get vaccinated. So ishikiate, what is an ishikiate? Ishikiate is a piece of fabric that is attached mainly onto the butt area of a unlined kimono, a hiroeri kimono, because when you sit in the seiza a lot, there is going to be a lot of tension on your center back seam at your bumps area, and the center back seam tends to rip there. And sometimes, especially for this kimono maker, very often because this fabric is very soft, even the fabric might suffer there. Having an ishikiate will just take a huge part of the tension away of the fashion fabric, and that is why I'm attaching it. How you attach it and what kind of fabric you want to attach depends. Usually for silk kimono you could use a silk lining. I very often have polyester attached there because silk lining is very expensive. Today I'm gonna use 100% cotton. For rami kimono and cotton kimono you would use cotton, and there is also the chance that you could use your fashion fabric when the bolt is actually long enough. And when you have a lot of old and antique kimono, you probably find like just a tiny piece sewn onto the center back seam at the approximately bum area, and that is your ishikiate. A very modern way is to put the ishikiate from the uchiage down to a few centimeters from the hem. That is my favorite way to do, so this is how I'm going to do it today. I made it out of sarashi. Sarashi is probably you would say muslin. It's just bleached cotton, and it is actually, I already sewed it together, so there's a center back seam, and this one is actually already in kimono bolt size, but a tiny bit smaller, so it's not gonna be as big as my back panels, this one here. So unfortunately I will completely have to blind stitch this on separately. I'm gonna have some fun today, I think. I love blind stitching and I was looking forward to this actually, especially also because this fabric is so much fun to blind stitch. I hadn't marked out my seam allowance on the ishikiate yet, so that's what I did first. And then I pressed down the seam allowance along that marking. Then I pinned the ishikiate on, starting right at the top, right on the stitching of the uchiage. First aligning the center back seam and pinning then down to the sides. And then the blind stitching marathon begins. Yesterday my sewing teacher was here just by instance, and she wanted to see how my progress was. Of course she wanted to see that. She was actually super happy with the outcome. She gave me a few tips that I could have done better, but she said it's basically I've done a very good job. She found a few little mistakes, but it's not that it would influence the whole kimono. And one of the mistakes is, and I don't know why I've done this, I already blind stitched the whole open side of the sleeves. I blind stitched this completely up and down, and apparently you shouldn't do this. Anyway, when you make a kimono by yourself, make sure to keep open from where the sleeves are going to be attached. I have thread marked this from a tiny bit below here to up here, and then you first attach the sleeve and then you blind stitch it down. So that's what you're supposed to do, and I've done this wrong. I do apologize. I don't want to take off this blind stitching. I don't know if you even can see it, but this is such an even nice blind stitching. Yeah, my teacher said she's amazed that I can blind stitch this well. And we're kind of like, yeah, I practice a lot, yay. Okay, so now I'm going to do something that's called toji in Japanese. What we're gonna do is we're gonna sew the two center back seams together. So I have a center back seam on my ishikiate, and I wanna sew the center back seam of my kimono with the center back seam of my ishikiate together. For the toji, I pin the center back seams together and sew the seam allowances together with big loose basting stitches. Leave the stitches so loose that you can still put your fingertip under it. This will make sure that the cotton thread for the toji has still enough room to actually shrink. And then I pinned and blind stitched down the sides. And then it's finally time to set in the sleeves. Align the sleeve and the main piece. Usually you set in the sleeves first and pinning it on while doing, but I barely could see my markings, so I decided to first pin it together and then start sewing. With the big possibility that I will probably have to repin some of the pins, which I did off camera. The sleeves are sewed on in a very specific way. You make 1 or 2 stitches back and forth through the beginning of your sleeve seam. Make sure to pull the needle really through the same point and leave a long tail on the other side. This is, by the way, again, easier when your sleeve isn't already pinned on. That's why you sew and pin basically at the same time when you do the sleeves. Then you tie it very tightly together. And start sewing. You start with very tiny back stitches right along the edge. And then you start to stitch away from the edge. And after circa 2 centimeters, you start to do a running stitch about 3 to 6 millimeters from the edge. When you have reached the top of the sleeves, you do a few back stitches. Yes, this is again where you back stitch. And then you start to do a running stitch back down again to about 2 centimeters from your seam end. This is where you start to slowly backstitch your way down and again getting closer to the edge. When I reach the end, I again turn the needle and then I stitched a few stitches back up again. Where I then tie it off and cut it. And then finally, this is where you fold the raw edge of the sleeve over and blind stitch it down. For the collar, it's all about measuring. So first I measure how much I need around the neckline, and then how long it is down from the okumi seam to the end of the collar. You have to take all those measurements separately on both sides, and only when they match up, you can start to mark the seam line out on the kimono. And those are the measurements I have marked out onto my collar pieces off camera, because I need a tiny bit of a head start with the collar because I really have to finish off the kimono today. I had a tiny bit of a imposter syndrome and started and finished different hand sewing projects instead of finishing this kimono, although this is for a video and the other projects were not really. What have I done with a whole month, honestly? I hope a lot of sewers to watch this can actually relate. In case this is your first kimono you ever make, be aware that kimono collars is the hardest thing to do on a kimono, because usually a collar is cut on the bias, so you can easily pull it into a nice shape. Unfortunately, kimono collars are cut on the straight grain, which means the fabric is absolutely not flexible at all, and you have to do some pinning magic to somehow make it work. We're going to do a so-called hiroeri. Hiroeri are the wide collars you have on kimono with a wide back lining. I do not really recommend those for beginners when you are kimono dressing beginner, because you have to fold it down when dressing yourself, and that is actually not really easy. So when you want to do an easier collar, please go to my video how to sew a kimono the easy way and use that collar shape. When you want to do a men's kimono are in general a tiny bit different than women's kimono, and they also have a different collar shape. Please refer to my video how to make a men's kimono. So let me show you what you need for making a hiroeri. You need a back collar that I've already pinned on. A back collar is usually some white silk, in this case because this is a Remi kimono. This is white cotton. I used the same fabric I used for my ishikiate. And then you have this long piece of collar that is twice the length of your okumi, and you cut this into two pieces and you sew the smaller piece. You sew the smaller piece here onto the long piece. I do recommend to, before you cut this down, when you have all the measurements on the kimono, put those measurements onto the collar and make sure that you have enough length for the long piece of the collar, and then just cut it down to the short piece, because that just really makes sure that you have enough length on both pieces. And the short piece, the length of this, actually does not really matter, honestly. What I did not do yesterday is to baste these together. I usually baste these two pieces here together inside of the seam allowance down here. Oh no, you can't see the markings at all. I don't even try to show you. So on this collar, as well as on my back collar, I have marked out a 1 centimeter seam allowance from one side all the way through, and from this side I measured 11.4 centimeter into the collar. That is the width you usually have for a hiroeri. And in length I marked out the center of my collar, the two neck opening sides, then the okumi sagari, and then the rest of the collar that will go down on the kimono. This is what I marked out on both collars. When you pin then the collar on, when you do a hiroeri, you will have first to pin on the back collar on the inside of the kimono. And now I'm gonna start to pin on this collar on the outside of the kimono. Again, starting in the center and then working my way down to the sides. And not to run out of pins, as soon as I pinned the collar in place, I took off the pin on the back and used that again. And you're gonna sew all the layers all together at once. It's gonna be really annoying. I will not be able to unshin this all the way through, which is okay. My pro tip is backstitch just all the way when you're not sure what to do, because backstitching usually gives you enough time to also play a tiny bit with the color and the fabric and helps you to really smoothen it out. When the collar is on, you press it down with your seam towards the outside of the kimono. And then you baste the fold in place. To finish off the ends of a collar is also something I have showed in many videos, but I'm showing it once more. You pin the two collar ends right side on right side together. Then you sew this together with a running stitch, about 8 mm from the actual end of your collar. Fold the seam allowance down towards the collar and press this. Turn it and press it again. Make sure that the fashion fabric collar shows for 5 mm on the back collar. After that, you fold the seam allowance of front and back collar in and pin them together. And make sure that the back collar is 5 mm shorter in width than the front collar. You can also see that I'm using a pulling thread, or in Japanese, hikiito, to shape the back collar nicely. And the last seam you will have to do is blind stitching the two collars together. Now I don't have any footage of me wearing this kimono in Kyoto because I was mostly by myself and I don't trust people, and I'm always afraid that someone would just steal my camera when I try to film something and just stand a tiny bit further away. So I'm really sorry for that. I am still happy how this kimono looks. I have done a really decent job. There are a few things, of course, I could have done better. I've done a few tiny mistakes, but I will bring this kimono to a cleaner store, have an arai hari done, and then I will restitch it anyway, and this is where I can fix all my little mistakes. I've say that so often because I'm never really sure if I'm definitely gonna do it, but I definitely want to, but probably won't. I want to do more videos like this of me showing to sew a kimono from a bowl, because I usually always have a current kimono sewing project that I simply just don't show to people because I'm basically doing it on my own. But I think it will be really interesting to have like a very similar video in a few months or in a year from now, and looking at myself how much progress I actually did. So when you've made it until here through this very long video, I thank you so much for watching. And when you're new here and you want to learn more about kimono from a professional kimono teacher, hit the subscribe button. I would be really happy to have you here, and I'll talk to you in my next video. Bye!